The mass airflow sensor is one of the more important sensors when it comes to adjusting the air-fuel ratio. It directly impacts how the car drives, the fuel efficiency, performance, and exhaust emissions. The problem is that the mass airflow sensor rarely triggers the check engine light or precise fault codes. That's why noticing the symptoms is very important. Symptoms of a bad mass airflow sensor are hesitation, surging, poor fuel economy, poor performance, black smoke, and difficulty starting the engine. Fault codes indicating misfires and rich or lean air-fuel mixture are also common, and in some cases the engine will often stall and you will see a check engine light. 10 symptoms of a bad mass airflow sensor. 1. Car hesitating to accelerate. There are two sensors in all cars that primarily regulate the air-fuel ratio. Those are the mass airflow sensor and the oxygen sensor, O2 sensor. Each time you press the gas pedal, the mass airflow sensor notices a change in air volume going into the engine and roughly adjusts the air-fuel ratio. Then, as the air and fuel are ignited, the O2 sensor registers how much oxygen is in the exhaust gas. That helps the engine control unit further adjust the air-fuel ratio, but when the mass airflow sensor is bad, it won't notice or report the change in air volume. That means the car won't start accelerating until the air reaches the oxygen sensor. Poor throttle response and hesitation are a result of that delay. In extreme cases where the mass airflow sensor is inaccurate, the delay can be as long as 3 to 5 seconds. 2. Car randomly surges forward. If you have ever run out of fuel while driving, you will have noticed that just before the engine shuts down, the revs will on its own. That's a result of insufficient fuel delivery, too much oxygen, or in other words, a lean air fuel mixture. The same thing happens when the mass airflow sensor is bad. A faulty mass airflow sensor can report that a lot less air is going into the engine than it actually is. The engine control unit then doesn't send enough fuel into the combustion chamber to compensate, and the RPMs surge. Once the mixture reaches the O2 sensor, the ECU readjusts it and the RPMs drop. This usually happens when you shift gears and the engine speed first jumps before it starts decreasing. It can also happen during idling, and it can even happen while cruising, which is especially unnerving. 3. Black smoke coming out of the exhaust. Black smoke coming out of the exhaust is a common symptom of a rich air-fuel mixture in diesel engines. Gasoline engines will almost never puff black smoke, even in extreme cases. It's also worth mentioning that some black smoke is normal for diesel engines, especially during hard acceleration. But if the mass airflow sensor is bad, thick black smoke will be present almost always, sometimes even at idle. This is a sign that the mass airflow sensor is reporting that a lot more air going into the engine than it actually is. The ECU then throws a bunch of fuel into the engine, and that excess fuel turns into smoke, soot, and carbon deposits. That makes what's called a rich air fuel mixture, which is the opposite of a lean air fuel mixture. This can be especially bad for the engine if you keep driving the car like this for a few hundred miles. It can clog up the catalytic converter, the EGR valve, and even the exhaust manifold. And naturally, with all that black smoke puffing out of the exhaust, the car will definitely fail the emissions test. 4. Check engine light. If you see a check engine light together with one or more of the symptoms we will mention, consider yourself lucky. A check engine light will almost certainly tell you what's wrong because misfires and lean or rich air fuel mixture don't trigger it. That means the fault code will indicate precisely what the problem is or what sensor is causing the problem. In the case of a mass airflow sensor, you will get a fault code ranging from P0100 to P0104. P0100 means MAF circuit malfunction, in which case you should also check the wiring and the connector. P0101 indicates a problem with the voltage range. P0102 and P0103 mean MAF sensor circuit low input and high input respectively, and P0104 means the MAF sensor circuit is intermittent, which could indicate problems with the charging system or the battery, but that's rare. Don't be surprised if you get fault codes indicating problems with the coolant temperature sensor, O2 sensor, or fuel system. Those can cause pretty much the same symptoms as a bad MAF sensor, so there's no need to further diagnose the MAF before replacing whatever sensor is faulty. 5. High fuel consumption. High fuel consumption is a direct product of a lean or rich air fuel mixture, which among other things is caused by a bad MAF sensor. When the air fuel mixture is rich, a lot of the fuel going into the cylinder is unburnt, In severe cases, you might even find raw fuel coming out of the exhaust and definitely a strong smell of gasoline. With so much fuel wasted, expect to see a 20% to 30% increase in fuel consumption, if not more. A lean air fuel mixture means a lot less fuel is going into the cylinders, but that doesn't mean the fuel consumption is lower. With too little fuel, the thermal efficiency of the engine is greatly reduced. In other words, the engine runs hotter because a lot of that fuel is converted into heat instead of power. That directly wastes fuel. Plus, the power is reduced. You have to rev the engine higher and open the throttle more, which again increases consumption. 6. Poor performance. In order for the engine to run as efficiently as possible, it needs just the right amount of fuel at every given moment. However, since the MAF sensor causes too little or too much fuel to go into the engine, the power output will be noticeably lower. If the air-fuel mixture is too rich, the fuel won't ignite properly and create an efficient expansion. And if it's too lean, the fuel burns a lot slower, which also results in reduced power. It's worth mentioning that the two conditions will have a different effect. A lean air-fuel mixture will significantly reduce the maximum power output at higher RPMs. A rich mixture will make the engine sputter and misfire at lower RPMs, while at the same time it runs fairly okay at higher RPMs. Also, a lean mixture makes the idle speed higher, while a rich mixture makes it lower, sometimes to the point that the engine stalls. 7. Frequent stalling. Stalling is an extremely common symptom of a bad air-fuel mixture. When the mixture is lean, the idle speed will be higher, but if you punch the gas pedal too fast, the engine will stall. The same thing happens when the mixture is too rich. Only in that case, the idle speed is already low. Stalling without any driver inputs is also common. If the mixture becomes too rich, the idle speed will simply keep dropping until the engine stalls. And if the mixture is too lean, the RPMs will jump up and down until eventually they drop too low. The car also stalls often when you first shift into drive. In that case, the load on the engine increases, and if the engine control unit can't adjust the mixture in time, the engine will stall. The idle speed will also be more erratic as you stop the car at a red light, for example, which also increases the chances of engine stalling. 8. Difficulty starting the engine. Whenever the engine is cold, and especially when the air temperature is cold, the engine needs a lot more fuel to fire up. In other words, it needs a much richer mixture during that initial cranking period. But that often doesn't happen when the MAF sensor is bad, which will have you cranking the engine noticeably longer than usual before it fires up. An excessively rich mixture will also cause starting issues. The engine will seem like it wants to fire up, but it can't. And once it does turn on, it will sputter and shake before it likely stalls. At the same time, you will notice a very strong smell of gasoline because a lot of raw fuel is going into the exhaust. 9. Lean or rich air fuel mixture fault codes. If you notice any of the symptoms we mentioned, the first step in diagnosing the problem is scanning the fault codes. A MAF sensor itself will only trigger a fault code if it's out of voltage range, so you have to rely on other fault codes to diagnose it. One of those is fault codes related to the air-fuel mixture. If the mixture is too lean, you'll get a P0171 fault code, sometimes in combination with a P0174 code. P0171 means cylinder bank 1 is lean, and P0174 means cylinder bank 2 is lean. These codes can also be caused by a dozen other faults like a vacuum leak, poor fuel delivery, and other sensors. The fault codes for a rich mixture are P0172 and P0175. These can also be caused by other faults, so you should keep going with diagnosing the issue. 10. Frequent misfires and misfire fault codes. Misfires are extremely common with a bad MAF sensor. Both rich and lean air fuel mixtures cause misfires. A rich mixture sometimes doesn't ignite at all, and other times it's too weak or too slow. The same goes for a lean air fuel mixture. The most common fault code in the case of a bad MAF sensor is a P0300, which means random misfires. Other times you might get fault codes ranging from P0301 to P0312. These indicate misfires on specific cylinders, which are more often a bad spark plug or a bad ignition coil. And again, the P0300 fault code can also be caused by other faulty sensors and vacuum leaks. Cost to replace a mass airflow sensor. There have been a lot of different types of MAF sensors over the years, so the prices range quite a bit. A new MAF sensor can cost anywhere between $50 and $300, depending on the type, the vehicle model, and how old it is. but the average price is around $100. As for labor, it only takes about 10 minutes to replace a MAF sensor, even on the most complicated cars. That makes the labor cost difficult to estimate, but anything over $50 should be considered unfair. But you can also easily replace the sensor yourself and save some money. Plus, cleaning the MAF sensor can often solve all the symptoms we mentioned, so try that before you buy a new one. Cleaning and replacing a mass airflow sensor. MAF sensors mostly rely on a really thin wire that sits right in the middle of the intake boot. Despite the air filter, that wire still picks up a lot of dust and dirt, which automatically makes it inaccurate. That's why cleaning the sensor is the first thing you should do before you buy a new one. To do that, all you need is an MAF cleaner spray or a carb cleaner. How to clean or replace the MAF sensor. Unplug the sensor and remove the intake boot. The MAF sensor sits inside the intake boot, or it has its own plastic housing that sits right after the air filter, making it a section of the intake boot. You first want to unplug the sensor by pushing the connector in, and then pressing the release tab and pulling it out. After that, loosen the two hose clamps holding it in place and remove it. If it sits inside the intake boot, remove the two bolts holding it down. Clean or replace the sensor. Once you have the old sensor out, you can go right ahead and install a new one in reverse order, and make sure to tighten the hose clamps to prevent any vacuum leaks. The MAF sensor also needs to be installed in the correct orientation, and you will find an arrow on it that has to point toward the engine or in the same direction as airflow. As for cleaning, look inside the sensor and you will see a thin wire. Spray some carb cleaner directly onto the wire and let the sensor dry for 10 to 15 minutes before reinstalling it. There is also no need to spray too much of the carb cleaner. A 3 or 4 quick squirts will do the trick. To summarize what we talked about in this video, unfortunately, none of the MAF sensor symptoms are all that conclusive unless you get one of the P0100 to P0104 fault codes. But of all the other sensors that can cause the same symptoms, the MAF sensor is the first one to fail. That means if you notice symptoms like black smoke, hesitation, poor performance, poor fuel economy, etc., you are safe to assume that the MAF sensor is bad. But to minimize the chances of wasting your money, have a professional monitor the live data, or clean it first and see if that helps. I hope this video helped. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and follow so you don't miss any of my videos.